Oscar Piastri extends his lead in the Formula One Drivers' Championship with victory in the Belgian Grand Prix, following F1's latest wet weather delay. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined by what is now a very dry lead editor, Ian Parks. It had just been raining, but Ian, there's obviously a pot of gold somewhere in the background at Spa-Francorchamps, because where do we begin? We've got to start, of course, with what was in the end an 18-minute delay due to the weather, which ended up giving us really a majority dry race, despite the amount of rain there's been in Spa-Francorchamps. And it's fair to say some interesting responses on the long delay.
Yeah, we've actually had a little bit of rain here, Nick, for about the last 20 minutes now. Circuit's wet. We've got a beautiful rainbow just behind me, as you can see. And you talked about a pot of gold. My word, could that race done with some sort of golden moments towards the end of it? Because I noted that after we had the tyre changes from inters to dries, Lewis Hamilton setting the tone for that, of course, after 11 laps. And then after 12 laps, we had the leaders, pretty much all the leaders had come in. For 32 laps after lap 12, the top eight were the top eight after those pit stops finished. Were the top eight by the checkered flag. It was that dull. We didn't even come close to a sniff of an overtake amongst that top eight. Yes, it all appeared to be bubbling up. We saw that obviously Oscar was on the medium tyre. Lando was asked if he wanted to go to the hard because it was believed it would be a good way to finish the race. Suggestion was maybe the hard might not go to the end. And we saw for a little while that Lando was just managing to reel Oscar in a little bit by little bit. But then, of course, we had those couple of mistakes by Lando Norris, which we'll go into a little bit more in detail. And in the end, it was done and dusted. It was a 1-2, not the 1-2 that Lando Norris would have wanted to have really closed down the championship gap on his teammate Oscar Piastri. Instead, it's Oscar that extends his championship lead to 16 points going into the final race before F1's summer shutdown in Hungary next weekend. And in all honesty, Nick, that one now cannot come soon enough, because what promised to be such an exciting Grand Prix in the end turned into nothing more than a damn squib after all that rain that we'd had that led to an 80-minute delay.
And of course, we had a rolling start rather than a standing start when green flag running did eventually get underway. And in many ways, what happened at the start of the green flag running was identical to what we saw at the beginning of the F1 sprint on Saturday. In that, Lando Norris, who was in the race lead, lost the lead to Oscar Piastri at Le Combe. It was the exact same with the sprint, with Piastri being overtaken by Max Verstappen. And in the end, with the exception of Lando's mistakes, that was that.
Such a shame, wasn't it? As I say, it really threatened to be such a promising race.
Yeah.
And for me, it's one of those debatable topics, and I know there's going to be a lot of comments on it. We've already got a difference of opinion with regard to the team principles, and I'm talking about, should there been that delay at the start? We had 80 minutes, as I mentioned, before the FIA decided, okay, it's time to go. However, we then had 4 laps behind the safety car before we had that rolling start. Now, of course, the difference of opinion I'm talking about, we had Max Verstappen, of course, quite vocal over the radio. Laura Mekies was asked about the length of time that it took, and bearing in mind his former role as FIA deputy race director, of course, he was not critical, but he was quite surprised, was his word, that it took so long to get things going. And then, of course, the flip side, you've got Andrea Stella, naturally his drivers finishing 1-2, praising the FIA for its perfect race call. So, as I say, difference of opinion. For me, I felt it was too safe.
I agree.
I felt the conditions at the start of the F2 race were actually worse than we had at the start of F1. And these are the F2 drivers, these are the guys that are still really learning the trade. The F1, of course, they're the best in the business, or so we're led to believe. And yet we had this inordinate delay. I felt we could have got going after an hour, in all honesty, never mind 80 minutes. And then the 4 laps behind the safety car, and then a rolling start.
Yeah, too
For
much.
me, for me, it was, I agree. I felt it was a bit too much. I'm sure, as I say, it's one of those, as always, the safety of the drivers is paramount. But boy, I do believe that we've seen these drivers race in far worse conditions that we had compared to what we saw most definitely with those 4 laps behind the safety car. And partly the rolling start, there was a comment from Oscar Piastri that kind of said it all, where he felt that the wet part of the grid on the start finish straight, which is just to my right over here, by the way, folks, as I'm recording this, was obviously considerably worse than the line that had formed on the racing line that had formed, bearing in mind those laps behind the safety car. So you could probably argue that anybody off the racing line on that part of the grid would have been heavily compromised because the track on that side was that much wetter. So you can kind of understand why there was the rolling start, but nevertheless, did we really need the safety car at the very beginning for those 4 laps? I think we could have had a standing start and had 44 full racing laps rather than the 40 that we eventually did.
Well, let us know, of course, for those watching this F1 update, your thoughts in the comments below on the rain delay, whether it was needed, whether we needed the 4 laps behind the safety car, if a rolling start was the correct call. Let us know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Very quickly, and before we move away from McLaren, Lando Norris, of course, did make a couple of mistakes, which ultimately ended his chances of catching Oscar Piastri. Did he have anything to add on his mistakes in the media pin?
So he basically turned around, just to go through the mistakes, it was estimated to be 1.2 seconds when he went off track at Pujol. Then he had a moment out of the La Source hairpin that cost roughly about another 0.6, 0.7 seconds. And then when he was fighting his way back after those, whereas Oscar Piastri made short work of Isaac Hadjar, the Racing Bulls driver, who was unfortunately ended up to be quite a considerable back marker at that stage of the Grand Prix. Lando Norris got stuck behind him and took well over more than half a lap to get past. All those three things combined, when you take into consideration the time between the duo at the checkered flag, which I think was about 3.4, 3.5 seconds, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
I've just forgotten it off the top of my head. Would Lando have had an opportunity late in the race if he'd done everything perfectly? Really hard to say. Even if he had, it would have been an almighty effort just to get in DRS range. And even as we've seen over this weekend with what happened with Oscar Piastri chasing Max Verstappen in the sprint race, even if you spend a considerable period of time in DRS range, it's one thing getting within range, it's actually another to then overtake. So it would have been incredibly difficult, I feel, for Lando to have made a move on Oscar, even if he managed to have got, as I say, within DRS range. It is what it is, according to Lando. Coulda, woulda, shoulda was one of his phrases with regard to those little errors that he'd made. Bearing in mind, he was chasing hard because he was meant to believe, having gone onto the hards, he was relatively safe to get to the checkered flag. It was a question of, would the mediums last? That was quite the surprise, in all fairness. 33 laps from Oscar Piastri at the end. We saw a few drivers unable to make their mediums last. Oscar was one of those, and in all fairness to him, he did a really good job. Lando effectively tipped his hat to Oscar. He did a good job, and he deserved the victory. Bearing in mind as well, for anybody that might have been wondering about the battery issues that Lando complained of, Andrea Stella turned around and said that once the race got unfolded behind that rolling start, that actually both drivers had issues. So Lando wasn't compromised. And in fairness, you really have to take your hat off to Oscar Piastri, because the move that he did, bearing in mind he was right behind Lando Norris in the spray, in the slipstream, going up Eau Rouge through Radion, that was some bravery to do that, because he would not have been able to have seen the back of Lando Norris's McLaren, with the exception, of course, of that flashing red light that gives the following driver an indication as to who's ahead of them. But yes, I thought a brilliant move by Oscar, and that in itself, given the bravery required to pull that off, was worthy in the end of the race victory he ultimately ended up with.
To very quickly run through the top 10 from the Belgian Grand Prix, it was, of course, Oscar Piastri victorious, ahead of Lando Norris, Charles Leclerc completing the podium, Max Verstappen 4th, George Russell 5th, Alex Albon in 6th. Obviously, being overtaken being so difficult, it really helped. Obviously, the Williams driver, Lewis Hamilton in 7th. We'll finish this video by touching on him. Liam Lawson 8th, Gabriel Bortoleto in a brilliant night for Stake, and Pierre Gasly in 10th. And yeah, Lewis, we've got to end on him because obviously he started basically at the back of the grid due to being one of 4 drivers with a new power unit, and had brilliant pace in the early stages in the damp conditions. Was the first driver, as you mentioned, to make that switch from intermediate to slicks, and at first had incredible pace. But as soon as the track dried up, it seemed it didn't even have an answer to overtake Alex Albon.
Now, managed to get marginally within DRS range, but even then, as we saw, couldn't really make it stick in the dry conditions. Whereas previously, as opposed to what we'd seen with that Ferrari at Silverstone in the wet, where Lewis had bemoaned it being the worst car he'd ever driven around Silverstone even in wet conditions primarily, he performed superbly. As you say, effectively, once we got the rolling start, he was 18th on track. Yes, he'd started in the pit lane, but that was negated by the fact that, as I say, once the rolling start commenced, he was 18th on track, but he did pull off a number of superb overtakes. And as I say, was the first to pull the trigger in going from the inters onto the medium tyres. And obviously, bearing in mind, a number of other drivers took a lap more to do so. By the time everything came out in the wash, shall we say, Lewis was 7th on track. And you thought at that stage, do you know what? Given the pace he's showing in that Ferrari, hasn't even got a chance of a podium here. But as we saw, just never materialized. Top 8 at the end of those pit stops, as I mentioned, were the top 8 come the checker flag. It was such a shame. I do feel that we could have had a really good race, but I think the bottom line, as we've seen over the course of this entire weekend, Nick, and it's something that I mentioned in the post-qualifying update on Saturday evening, referring to something that Andrea Stella mentioned in his post-qualifying debrief, that this circuit, once so renowned for producing great racing, superb overtaking maneuvers, of late, given the evolution of these cars and these ground effect cars under the current regulations, which of course we are doing away with from next year, ultimately it's just led to what we've seen in particular this weekend, 2 real dead duck races that have really produced barely an overtaking move worthy of the name.
Well, hopefully we won't get that next weekend at the Hungary, but only time will tell. We'll have to find out soon.
It's a tight, twisted circuit. It's a real... God, yeah, that could be even worse. Fingers crossed it isn't. But, you know, given the nature of the Hungary ring, we know what that track can be like. We need something to finish this first part of the season on a real good note and talking point before we go into the F1 summer shutdown. Otherwise, we're just going to be lazing on our beaches and thinking, oh, well, roll on the second part once we get to Zandvoort and Monza to kickstart.
And of course, we will be discussing the Belgian Grand Prix, some of the more deeper talking points in terms of obviously the weather delay, for example, and overtaking being so difficult in Monday's podcast, of course, with myself and Ian and Sam. Absolutely cool. For those of you watching this video, please do smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, let us know your thoughts on the race below, and join us for the podcast on Monday. See you later.
Take care as always, folks. Thanks for watching and listening.